Movies based on video game properties rarely ever do well, but the same isn't necessarily true the other way around. There have been a few film franchises that have made the jump to video games and done very well for themselves, and James Bond is definitely one of them. It hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows, of course. There have been a few bad 007 games, sure, but there have also been plenty of really good ones. In this feature, we'll be listing out what we feel are the best 007 games of all time, starting off with number 10 and counting right down to the top spot. Without further ado, let's jump in. Tomorrow Never Dies. Being the first 007 game made by EA after they acquired the license, as well as the first 007 game to be released after the incredible GoldenEye 007, Tomorrow Never Dies had a great deal to live up to. Did it do that? Well, no, not entirely. But viewed in isolation, it was a pretty fun game, featuring some solid third-person action and what was at the time a great realization of the film it was based on. Tomorrow Never Dies was a game that one could get plenty of enjoyment out of. Sure, it wasn't a very meaty experience, to say the least, and sure, it hasn't aged all that well, but for its time, it was a decent enough game. The world is not enough. EA brought James Bond back into the first-person perspective for their second game based on the property after Tomorrow Never Dies, and their second outing proved to be a marked improvement. The campaign was longer and more varied, providing a much more enjoyable experience, while the game also took the excellent multiplayer blueprint of GoldenEye and built upon that, delivering a similarly addictive competitive experience. It may not have been the most original or memorable Bond game, but back in its day, it was still a ton of fun. GoldenEye 007, 2010. Bearing the name of the 1997 N64 classic, the Wii's GoldenEye 007 2010, later released for the PS3 and the Xbox 360 as GoldenEye 007 Reloaded, was more a reimagining than a remake. It was also a reimagining of the classic film, telling its story in the more grounded and visceral style of Daniel Craig's now rebooted Bond movies, while also starring him in the lead role instead of Pierce Brosnan. The entire shift of the case hurt the story and storytelling a bit, while the multiplayer ended up feeling somewhat disappointing, but solid stealth and shooting and some really excellent action set pieces still made this game worth playing, if not nearly as good as the masterpiece that inspired it. James Bond 007, Bloodstone. Bloodstone fell by the wayside upon launch, sadly, failing to sell very well and not being received very well, but this is actually a really good game. Featuring Daniel Craig as the man with the license to kill in a story crafted just for the game, Bloodstone was more than just a competitive third-person shooter. The narrative itself was nothing to write home about, but with some great action, thumping melee combat, and intense set pieces, it was certainly a game that deserved way more attention than it got. 007 Quantum of Solace. Quantum of Solace was the first game that Activision made after they acquired the 007 license, and it turned out to be much better than anyone expected, especially in retrospect. Developed by Treyarch, the game encompassed both Casino Royale and its sequel, the game's namesake, featuring first-person shooting action reminiscent of Call of Duty with a cool little third-person cover mechanic thrown in. The campaign was a fun romp through Daniel Craig's first two Bond films, but it was in the competitive multiplayer that the game really shone, and it really managed to find and hold on to its audience. James Bond 007, Agent Under Fire. Agent Under Fire was another solid Bond adaptation under the management of EA. Can you imagine saying that sentence in today's day and age? Featuring a campaign that boasted a healthy and varied mix of intense on-rail segments, classic first-person firefights with solid shooting mechanics, and some good old fast-paced driving sections, Agent Under Fire had plenty to keep solo players satisfied. But it was with its multiplayer that it really found its feet, like so many other Bond games. Its four-player split-screen online modes were addictive and thoroughly engaging, and though it's hard to think of them as going toe-to-toe with GoldenEye, for many, it was also a game that they sunk dozens of hours into exactly because of that multiplayer. James Bond 007, From Russia with Love. In 2005, EA decided to revisit From Russia with Love, starring the likeness and voice of the first, and in the opinions of many, the best, James Bond, Sean Connery. Connery's involvement kicked everything up a notch with the fantastic performance he delivered, bringing the game, his character, and the story to life in incredible ways. From Russia with Love was, for its time, also a great-looking game, with impressive visuals and animations that made every bit of its intense action look as good as it felt in gameplay. James Bond 007, Nightfire. More specifically, we're talking about Nightfire's console version here. Remember the days when games used to have completely different versions on different platforms? If not for one other game we'll be hearing about very shortly, you know which one, Nightfire would probably be the best first-person Bond game to date. It has a solid, high-octane campaign, which is an absolute blast in spite of how short it was, thanks to its quick pace and its varied missions. But once again, the game really shone with its multiplayer, which could be an absolute time sink with how addictive it was. James Bond 007, Everything or Nothing. Everything or Nothing is, for many, the greatest Bond game to date, and it's not hard to see why. Even for us, it's very, very close to the top. Featuring bombastic action, set pieces that absolutely blew us all away when we first experienced them, incredible combat that balanced flashy melee and third-person shooting almost perfectly, and a star-studded cast that even had Pierce Brosnan playing James Bond himself, this was truly the representation of EA pulling out all the stops to make the ultimate 007 game. It's also a game that one can still go back to today and still enjoy thoroughly. Goldeneye 007. The obvious choice, but it's obvious for a reason. First-person shooters on consoles are a dime a dozen now, but back in 1997, when even the concept of analog sticks and console controllers was fairly new, Rare and Nintendo made the genre work on the N64, and they didn't just make it work. They delivered what is to this day considered one of the greatest shooters of all time. GoldenEye 007 is an absolutely incredible game, with a memorable campaign and addictive multiplayer that dominated gamers' lives for years. And that wraps it up. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos daily. Also, don't forget to switch on the bell notification icon, that way you don't miss out on any of our videos.